Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and so far in this series now we've got our magic spells up and running, our hotbar works well, and we can even collect items. However, there's a couple of little tweaks I'd like to add to this hotbar to just make it function a little better. For example, I'd like to add some labels so it's a little more clear which spell is currently equipped. We're going to add a radial timer so that it's a little more obvious how much time remains on the cooldown for a spell. We'll add a nice pop effect so that once the spell's ready, it's obvious that it's ready. And finally, we'll do an optional part where we can move away from one global cooldown for all spells to giving each spell their own custom cooldowns so that you can still cast Spark while Heal is on cooldown. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. Now, since the last video, I had a number of people suggest that it was a little bit unclear which spell was currently selected and that adding the name might be helpful. This is actually really easy to do, so I thought we'd do this first. So let's head into our spell slot prefab and open that up. And in here, we're just going to right click on the spell slot itself and add a new UI Text Mesh Pro element. I'm just going to size that up and I'll put mine underneath here. I'll call this one Heal Spell for now. And then we can just sort of tweak our other attributes. I'm going to go a size 24, center it. I'm also going to add a little bit of an outline and just increase the thickness to make this look a little better. We'll add some underlay. I like to have a little bit of X and Y offset, so there's a sort of shadow effect coming from the top right and casting the shadow down to the left. Finally, I'm just going to add a little face as this font is quite skinny, and we can just add a little bit of dilation to make it take up a little more space and have a little more chunkiness to it. While we're here, I'd like to set up the UI for our radial countdown timer as well. To do this, I'm just going to click on the icon and duplicate it. We'll then rename this one as overlay, and essentially this is going to be the exact same thing as the icon. We're just going to shade it a little bit darker and then have the radialness sort of have the dark erase until it's fully viewable. So to do this, we're going to change our image type to filled, and I'm going to keep mine with the defaults of radial 360 and filling from the bottom, though you can play with those as you like. And you can see here what it'll look like as that countdown timer goes. Now to set up our text display, we're going to be doing our work in the spell slot script specifically, as each slot will just manage turning on and off its text when it gets selected. First, we'll have to add the namespace of using TM Pro, and then just for organization's sake, I'm going to add a header here to note that these top ones are all special references we need to make. We'll then make a serialized private TMP text reference, which we'll just call spell text. Now toggling this is really quite simple. We'll come down to our set highlight, which either turns the highlight on or off, depending on whether or not a spell is active. And here we'll add an if statement. So if it is currently active and it has a spell assigned, then we want to first of all set its spell text's text to be equal to, and here we'll just grab the currently assigned spell and grab its name. So that will set the text for it to say the correct name. Then down below, we'll just make its enabledness equal to whether or not it's active. So if a false value is passed in, it'll turn it off, and if a true one is passed in, it will turn the text on. That's all we have to do. Now back in Unity, we will want to go back into our spell slot and open up the prefab. Then here we now have a spot for our spell text, which we'll just drag in there. With that done now, we can also turn off the Text Mesh Pro component, not the game object, but the component itself. That way the text will be turned off when things start. One last note before we get going here is just that in the last video I only actually renamed one of my spells, so if we test this now only one of them will work. So I'm just going to quickly go into my other spells and make sure that I've given them item names. With that done, we can now go into test mode, and when we collect scrolls, you'll see the first one is automatically displaying its name, and when I toggle, they both work. At the moment, they don't quite fit perfectly. I might want to downsize my text just a little, but it's working. Next, we want to get that radial cooldown timer working, so let's head back into spell slot again and make another serialized private reference. This time it will be an image, and we'll call it cooldown overlay. Alright, so first off, we need to make sure that the icon for the overlay actually matches the spell that's currently equipped. We can do this in our set spell method right before we actually set the icon image that shows what spell is equipped. We'll also make sure that the cooldown overlay gets its sprite set to the same image. This is the moment where I notice I've been spelling cooldown overlay wrong, so I'll just fix that quickly. Now at the bottom here, we're going to make sure that the cooldown's fill amount is set to 0, meaning we won't be able to see it at all, and that's true regardless of whether a spell is being passed in or a spell is being taken away. We don't want the overlay to show here. That's why I put it at the bottom. Next, we're just going to need a public method that can notify the spell slot of when we need to trigger its cooldown. And this is going to need to take in a float so that it knows how long that cooldown will be. Now, because we're going to be doing some timer work here, it's a lot easier if we move this into a coroutine. And so here we're going to start a coroutine. We'll call it cooldown routine, and it's just going to pass along the amount of time that the cooldown should last for. Now for our coroutine, we'll use the IEnumerator interface. We'll just call this cooldown routine, and it also needs to take in a float for the duration of the cooldown. And in order for our code to recognize an IEnumerator, we need to make sure that we are using the system.collections namespace. We can then come back down. Now, whenever our cooldown is triggered, we want to start by first of all filling our cooldown overlay. So we'll make its fill amount 1. We're then going to need to start counting the cooldown. So we'll start with a float, which we'll use elapsed for short, but it's just how much time has elapsed, and we'll start that at 0. We're then going to use a while loop. So as long as the elapsed time is less than the duration, so if the cooldown's 2, as long as less than 2 seconds have passed, we'll keep going through this loop. Now we need to keep track of our elapsed time. So each time we come through this loop, we're just going to add to it the delta time. We're then going to take our overlay itself and have its fill amount start at 1, but each time we're going to subtract the elapsed time divided by our duration. This will just cause it to slowly decrement down until it gets to 0. We'll then use yield return null, which essentially just waits a frame and then goes back to the top of the loop again. And this just ensures that a little bit of time passes each loop so that eventually our cooldown timer will in fact find itself empty. Now, anytime you're using a loop like this in a coroutine, it's a good idea at the end to make sure that your target, in our case the cooldown overlay, does reach exactly the amount you're aiming for, just in case it's off by a tiny fractional amount when you do your loop. So now we just need to actually call that trigger cooldown method. So we'll head back to our Spell UI managers. This is the sort of mediator that knows where all the different slots are. And we're going to create a new method here down at the bottom. Now this is just an intermediary, as the actual spell will be cast in our magic script. So this one will be another public void trigger cooldown. It's going to need to know which spell is currently being triggered, as well as the total time of its cooldown. Now whenever we trigger this method, we're going to use a for each loop to immediately look at every slot in our slots list up above. Here, we'll just check each of them, and if that slot's assigned spell is equal to the one that was just cast, meaning that is the active slot, then we'll want to tell that slot to trigger its cooldown and pass along the amount of time. At this point, we can just call break, as we don't need to continue this loop any longer since we've found our target slot. Now we just need to call that trigger, so we'll head into Magic and go right down to the bottom into our cast spell method. At the very bottom of this, we'll just tell our Spell UI manager to trigger its cooldown, pass along the current spell, as well as the current spell's cooldown. Alright, make sure that you've saved each of these and we can head back to Unity. Back in Unity, let's head into our spell slot prefab one more time and just make sure that we hook up the cooldown overlay. We can then play the game, and as soon as we've collected a couple of spells, we can go ahead and cast it, and you'll see that there is in fact a cooldown running on that spell, which just makes it a little more interesting to look at. However, at the moment, that single cooldown is keeping us from casting any spells at all, and I'd like to expand this so that each spell can operate on its own cooldown bar. Additionally, I'd like to add a little bit more effect when a spell is ready so that it sort of pops, letting us know that it's ready to cast again. Alright, now probably the easiest is that pop effect when the spell is ready, so let's start there. We'll head into our spell slot and make a new header for pop settings, and here we're just going to need 2 variables. The first will be a private serialized float. We'll call it pop scale, and this is how big we want it to get. I'll use 1.3 so it goes to about 30% extra size. We'll then make another serialized private float for the duration of the pop, and we want this to be relatively quick. I'm just going to try 0.15 to start. Now then, when we get to the end of our cooldown routine, we're going to actually call another coroutine, but here we're going to yield return, meaning don't continue or run this again until this other one is finished. And now we'll call the pop effect coroutine. We'll have to make that, so another private IEnumerator called pop effect, and this is going to run very similar to what we did for our cooldown. We'll start with an elapsed time of 0, though this time we're also going to need a float for the half duration, as we're going to want it to pop during the first half of the timer and then return to normal size during the second half. This will just be our pop duration divided by 2. Next, we want to control the growing of the icon during that first half of our pop duration, so we'll use a while loop here, and as long as our elapsed time is less than half duration, we're going to continue to have it grow. Now each time we go through the loop, we want to make sure that our elapsed time goes up by the delta time. And then we'll have a float called t, or time, which is essentially tracking how far we are from when we start the pop to when it's supposed to be at its fullest. We get this by constantly dividing our elapsed time by the half duration value. Now we can actually take our icon image and have it grow. For this, we're going to use something called a Vector 3 lerp, or linear interpolation, which is essentially just a straight line growth from our starting point to our goal point. And just how far we are along that line depends upon t. We'll then add yield return null, so that again, it just keeps going through this loop until we've reached the end of our t, our time, and the icon has grown all the way. At this point, we want to actually have it shrink back down again. So we're just going to repeat this process, set our elapsed time back to 0, and now we can just copy paste this entire while loop. Only this time we want to start with our pop scale and then move towards normal scale throughout the course of our loop. At the very end, we one more time want to make sure that the local scale of our icon image gets set to the amount that it's supposed to be at, just in case it is fractionally off, which at this point is our normal scale once again. Alright, back in Unity we can collect our scrolls, test it out, and we are in fact getting that pop effect, though it's really fast. And in fact, I'm just going to actually try this over again with a 0.4, and there we go. I feel like that's working much nicer. Alright, I know this has been a long one, and this next part is optional. If you want to keep global cooldowns, you can do that. However, I feel like most people are probably going to want each spell to have its own. So let's head into our magic script and make this happen. First of all, we can get rid of next cast time, as now each spell is going to have to track its own. We'll also get rid of our can cast property here. We will rewrite this in a minute, but it's going to be a little more complex now. We'll just replace those with a private dictionary. And this is just going to hold a list of spell SOs paired with floats, which will keep track of their next cast time. We also need to initialize this as just a new empty dictionary of spell SOs and floats. So first, we need a way to actually add spells to this dictionary. So every time we learn a new spell, we'll check to see if our spell cooldowns dictionary already contains that spell SO. We'll then add a does not, because if it does not already contain it, we want to add this spell and its next cast time to the dictionary. We can do this by just doing spell cooldowns, and we'll give it an index of whatever spell SO we're currently learning, and then we'll add its next cast time, which will start at 0, but as you'll be able to cast it right away when you learn it. Now, if you scroll down a bit, you'll notice our cast spell method is a mess. Don't worry, we'll get to that in just a sec, but first we need to replace our can cast property we got rid of. This is now going to become a full method, and it's going to return a bool, a true or false value for whether or not we can cast. It's also going to take in a spell SO, as we'll be able to ask it by giving it a spell whether or not we're ready to cast that specific spell. Now each time we call this method, it's just going to ask a question. So is the current time, so time.time, greater than or equal to the spell cooldowns entry for the spell that we're casting? Now, down in our cast spell method, we can make this work by not just looking at the property for can cast, but actually calling the method and passing along our current spell. Now it'll check if that spell specifically is ready. If it's not, it'll return and not let us cast the spell. We can then get rid of that old next cast time, which was the global cooldown, and now we'll talk to our spell cooldowns dictionary, grab the current spell entry and make sure that its new next cast time is set to the current time plus whatever its cooldown is. So again, if we cast it at the 1 minute mark and it has a cooldown of 2, its next cast time for that spell will be at 1 minute and 2 seconds. Now, if you were to pop into Unity right now, you'd find that we have a couple of errors, and that's just because our states that cast spells are still trying to use that old can cast method. We just need to go in there and change it to, instead of just checking the can cast property, we're going to call the can cast method, so put brackets on this, and then it needs to know which spell, and this is a little roundabout because Magic already knows, but we need to give it that info, so we'll just do magic.currentSpell. We'll then head into our move state where we need to do the exact same thing, changing our property check into an actual method call, and then passing along Magic's current spell so that it knows which spell we want to check for casting readiness. With that, we're now fully ready to test this out. We can collect our spells, we've got the titles working, and we can also cast multiple spells now. So while we're waiting for our heal cooldown, we can go ahead and cast Sparks to our heart's content. We're also getting that nice pop at the end that just makes it more clear when spells are ready. Alright, I hope you found this one helpful. In our next video, we're finally going to get to that chest video I've been promising, where we can collect spells from actual treasure chests. Hope to see you there. Until then, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.